Margaret had always been proud of her discipline when it came to health. At 60, too, she considered herself the model of what a retired teacher should look like: fit, active, and full of life. Every morning began with the same routine: a glass of warm lemon water, a few gentle stretches by the window, and then her ritual power breakfast. The blender on her kitchen counter was her most trusted companion, humming each morning as she tossed in handfuls of spinach, kale, a few slices of green apple, and a scoop of chia seeds. She would pour the thick, emerald smoothie into a tall glass and lift it like a toast to herself. To another day of good choices, she'd whisper. But lately, those good choices didn't seem to feel so good anymore. It started with small things, her knees aching when she bent to pick something up, or a dull pressure in her lower back that wouldn't fade no matter how many yoga stretches she did. Then came the exhaustion. By early afternoon, she'd feel drained, her head heavy, her focus slipping away. She blamed it on getting older, on the weather, even on stress, anything but her food. After all, how could vegetables, green, beautiful, healthy vegetables, be the problem? One Thursday morning, the routine faltered. She was in her garden, watering her tomato plants, when the edges of her vision began to blur. A rush of dizziness hit her so suddenly that she dropped the hose and clutched at the wooden fence to steady herself. For a moment the world tilted. Her breath came in short gasps, and her heart thudded hard in her chest. When the feeling passed, she sank onto the bench beside the roses, her hands trembling. "What's happening to me?" she whispered. Her daughter, Emily, had been urging her for months to get a checkup. "Mom, you're not 25 anymore," Emily teased, though her tone always carried concern. "You do so much right, but you might be missing something." Margaret had brushed it off every time. She didn't want another doctor telling her she was just getting older. But after that dizzy spell, fear crept in, quiet but insistent. That afternoon, she sat in her living room, scrolling through her phone, searching for specialists nearby. One name caught her attention: Dr. Adrian Lewis, nutrition and longevity specialist. His profile photo showed a kind, calm face with gentle eyes. His reviews were glowing. People called him a life changer, a body whisperer. It felt different somehow, not clinical, but compassionate. Without overthinking, she booked an appointment for the next morning. The following day, she dressed neatly, smoothing her light gray sweater and pinning up her hair before heading out. The clinic was tucked on a quiet street, lined with maple trees whose leaves were beginning to turn gold. Inside, the waiting area smelled faintly of eucalyptus. The receptionist smiled warmly and handed her a form. When Dr. Lewis finally stepped out to greet her, he didn't rush. "Margaret," he said, shaking her hand, "I'm glad you came in." She followed him into a small office filled with sunlight and shelves of neatly arranged books titles on holistic nutrition, inflammation, aging, and energy medicine. A potted fern sat in the corner, its green fronds spilling lazily over the side of the pot. "So," he began, glancing over her notes, "you've been feeling tired and achy lately." "Yes," she said, exhaling heavily, "and it doesn't make sense. I eat clean, I exercise, I barely touch sugar or processed food." He smiled faintly. "Tell me about your diet, from breakfast to dinner, everything." Proudly, she began listing her meals. "Mornings are smoothies with spinach, kale, sometimes avocado. Lunch is usually salad, eggplant, tomatoes, cucumbers, olive oil. Dinner might be some roasted vegetables or corn soup. I don't eat much meat anymore." As she spoke, Dr. Lewis's expression grew thoughtful, almost concerned. "Those are all excellent foods," he said slowly, "but at your age, your body doesn't process everything the same way it used to." Margaret frowned. What do you mean? They're just vegetables. He turned his computer screen toward her, showing a simple chart. They're good vegetables, but some of them can be difficult for older bodies to handle. As we age, the body's enzyme production slows, kidney function changes, and certain natural compounds in foods like oxalates and alkaloids can build up and cause inflammation. She stared at him, puzzled. I thought inflammation came from junk food. It can, he said, but sometimes it also comes from foods that are too harsh for your system at this stage of life. Spinach and kale, for example, great sources of nutrients, but they're high in oxalates. When oxalates accumulate, they can form tiny crystals that irritate your joints and muscles. It's a common cause of pain and fatigue in people over 60. Margaret blinked, her heart sinking. You're saying my smoothies might be hurting me? He nodded gently. Possibly, and that's not all. Eggplant, part of the nightshade family, can increase inflammation in people sensitive to alkaloids. Corn, though a staple, is high in sugar and can destabilize blood sugar levels, especially in slower metabolisms. She stared down at her hands. The room felt quiet, the hum of a distant air vent the only sound. For years she had built her mornings on those very foods, trusting every health blog and wellness show that praised them. I don't understand, she said softly. I thought I was doing everything right. Doctor, Lewis leaned forward, his tone kind. You were doing the best you knew how, but our bodies evolve. What nourished you at 40 may burden you at 60. The goal isn't to fear food. It's to work with your biology as it changes. The words settled into her like a gentle truth. She had spent so long fighting her body, pushing through fatigue, blaming age, when perhaps her body had been whispering for her to listen all along. When the appointment ended, Dr. Lewis handed her a small pamphlet titled Eating for Longevity, Foods That Love You Back. Inside was a list of alternatives: watercress instead of kale, romaine instead of spinach, zucchini instead of eggplant, pumpkin instead of corn. The swaps were simple, but felt revolutionary. Outside, the autumn air was crisp. Margaret stood by her car, pamphlet in hand, watching leaves spiral down from the trees. For the first time in months, she didn't feel defeated by her age. She felt curious, hopeful even. That evening, she returned home and placed her blender carefully on the counter. She stared at it for a long moment, remembering how she used to feel so virtuous standing there every morning, believing she was nourishing herself. Then she smiled faintly and whispered, "Time for a new recipe." She opened her fridge and began pulling things out: romaine, a cucumber, a few sprigs of parsley. The kitchen filled with the clean scent of fresh greens as she chopped and blended, her movements slower, more intentional. When she took her first sip of the new smoothie, it tasted light and refreshing, like renewal. Sitting at her kitchen table, she wrote a small note in her journal. Lesson 1. Sometimes what you believe is saving you might be the very thing holding you back. Outside her window, the evening sky burned orange and gold. Margaret sat quietly, sipping, thinking not of loss but of transformation. Maybe, she thought, health wasn't about clinging to what once worked, but about having the courage to begin again. The next morning, Margaret woke before dawn, her mind replaying every word Dr. Lewis had said. The house was still and quiet, the air heavy with the faint scent of rain that had fallen overnight. She sat at her kitchen table, the pamphlet open before her, reading it again and again as if it were a secret map. Watercress instead of kale, romaine instead of spinach, pumpkin instead of corn. The swaps seemed too simple, almost trivial, but something deep within her told her that simplicity might be exactly what she needed. She made herself a cup of herbal tea and watched the steam curl upward, her reflection faintly visible in the window. The truth was, she had built her entire sense of control around her health routines. After her husband died 5 years ago, food and fitness had become her structure, her way of coping. The green smoothies, the salads, the yoga, they weren't just habits. They were her identity. The idea that those very choices might be slowly harming her felt like a betrayal. But Margaret was not the type to wallow for long. She was a woman of action. So that morning, she grabbed her canvas tote bag, wrapped her scarf around her neck, and headed to the Saturday farmers' market downtown. The air was cool, filled with the earthy aroma of fresh produce and the chatter of vendors calling out their daily specials. "Good morning, Margaret," called out Sam, the elderly man who ran the organic stall at the corner. He'd known her for years and always set aside extra kale for her. "Got your favorite greens today." Margaret smiled, hesitating. "Actually, Sam, not this time. Doctor's orders," she said lightly, scanning the other vegetables. His eyebrows lifted. "No kale. You feeling all right?" "I think I will be," she said, reaching for a bunch of crisp romaine and a handful of watercress instead. The leaves were lighter, almost delicate in her hands. As she moved through the aisles, she found herself looking at everything differently. She picked up a pumpkin, running her fingers over its smooth orange surface. The vendor told her how to roast it with a drizzle of olive oil and cinnamon, and Margaret felt a spark of excitement, like discovering a new world hidden in plain sight. By the time she returned home, her tote bag was full of unfamiliar yet inviting ingredients: zucchini, romaine, parsley, pumpkin, even a small piece of ginger. She spread everything out on the kitchen counter, the colors vibrant under the morning light. It felt like an artist staring at a blank canvas. Cooking had always been practical for her, a way to stay healthy, not a source of joy. But as she chopped the zucchini and blended her first doctor-approved smoothie, something inside her shifted. The drink came out a lighter shade of green, the scent fresh and earthy. When she took a sip, it wasn't bitter like her old smoothies. It was soft, clean, and unexpectedly pleasant. As the week went on, Margaret threw herself into her new plan with quiet determination. She replaced her old recipes with gentler ones. Instead of raw kale salads, she made warm bowls of sautéed greens with olive oil and garlic. Instead of corn soup, she tried pumpkin puree with a sprinkle of nutmeg. Every meal became a small experiment, and every bite carried the question, "Will this help me feel better?" By the 5th day, she began to notice subtle changes. The ache in her knees had softened. The pressure in her lower back had eased. She no longer felt that heavy, sluggish tiredness in the afternoons. She could move more easily, her energy returning like sunlight filtering through clouds. It wasn't dramatic. It was gentle, steady, believable. One morning, while tending to her tomato plants, she realized something even more profound. The dizziness that had frightened her before hadn't returned once. She stood tall in her garden, inhaling the scent of damp soil and fresh herbs, and felt grounded for the first time in months. That afternoon, she had her follow-up appointment with Dr. Lewis. She wore a pale blue sweater and tied her hair back with a simple clip, her skin glowing a little brighter. When he saw her, he smiled immediately. "You look different," he said. Margaret laughed. "I feel different. I can't believe it, but just a week of small changes. And it's like someone turned the lights back on inside me. That's your body saying thank you," he said warmly. "Sometimes healing isn't about doing more. It's about removing what's quietly harming you." She nodded, thoughtful. "It's strange. I spent so long believing that if something was green and natural, it had to be good. But I guess it's not that simple. Nature is powerful," he said. "And power needs balance. Foods that are medicine in one decade can become burdens in another. Our chemistry evolves, and if we don't evolve with it, even the best foods can become poisons." His words stayed with her long after she left the clinic. That evening, as she prepared dinner, she thought about all the people she knew, friends her age, who struggled with fatigue, joint pain, or mysterious health issues, yet still clung to the same superfoods because they were told they were healthy. Margaret decided she wouldn't keep this discovery to herself. The next morning, she called her book club group and invited them over for lunch. "You're all going to be my guinea pigs," she said with a laugh when they arrived. Her friends, a lively mix of retired teachers, nurses, and artists, filled the kitchen with chatter and curiosity. "What's this about?" asked Linda, her closest friend. Margaret smiled mysteriously as she set down a large bowl of salad romaine, watercress, cucumber, pumpkin seeds, and a light lemon dressing. "It's about something my doctor told me, and you're going to taste the proof." They ate, talked, and laughed, but soon the conversation turned serious as Margaret shared her story. She told them about the fatigue, the dizziness, and the shocking realization that some of her beloved vegetables were no longer serving her. By the time she finished, the room was quiet. Then Linda put her fork down and said softly, "You might have just changed all of our lives, Margaret." That evening, after everyone left, Margaret sat alone by her kitchen window again. The last light of day spilled across the countertop where the remnants of the salad still sat. She thought about how close she had come to simply accepting her pain as normal aging. But maybe, she realized, getting older didn't have to mean slowing down. It just meant learning your body's new language. As the crickets began their evening song, she wrote in her journal, "Lesson 2. Healing begins not with new habits, but with new awareness." She looked at the small plant on her windowsill, a pot of watercress she'd bought that morning, and smiled. It was a symbol now, not just of her new diet, but of her willingness to adapt, to keep learning. The truth wasn't that her body had betrayed her. It was that it had been trying to teach her all along, gently, patiently, waiting for her to listen. And now that she finally had, she promised herself she never would stop listening again. A month passed, and autumn had settled gently over the little town. The air had turned crisp, and golden leaves gathered along Margaret's porch steps. She moved through her mornings with a lightness she hadn't felt in years. Her joints no longer screamed when she bent down to water her garden, and the dull fatigue that once followed her everywhere had faded like mist in sunlight. Each sunrise felt like a quiet blessing. Her days began the same way now, with a glass of warm water, a prayer of gratitude, and a bowl of her new healing breakfast, roasted pumpkin with oats, cinnamon, and a drizzle of honey. It was simple, nourishing, and comforting, the kind of meal that felt like medicine for the soul. Her friends, too, had started following her new approach. After that lunch gathering, they had been inspired. Linda called a week later, amazed that her migraines had eased. Another friend said her blood pressure readings had improved. Word spread quietly through their social circles, and soon Margaret was getting calls from people she hadn't spoken to in years, all curious about her vegetable revelation. At first she laughed it off. "Oh, I'm no doctor," she would say, "just someone who finally listened to her body." But as the calls kept coming, she realized that people weren't just seeking recipes, they were searching for hope. They were tired of being tired, so one evening, at Linda's encouragement, she decided to take a small leap. She set up her old tablet on the kitchen counter, opened the camera, and hit record. "Hello, everyone," she began, smiling nervously. "My name is Margaret. I'm 60, 8 years old, and I want to share something that changed my life." She spoke simply and honestly, just as she would to a friend. She told the story of her dizziness, her doctor's warning, and the surprising truth about how certain vegetables, ones she thought were helping, had been slowing her down. She talked about the replacements that brought her energy back, the subtle signs of healing, and the importance of adjusting your diet as your body changes with age. She didn't use big words or fancy terms, just warmth and sincerity. You don't have to give up eating well, she said toward the end. You just have to learn what well means for you, right now, in this stage of life. She uploaded the video, thinking only a few friends might see it. But overnight it exploded. Thousands of views poured in. Comments filled with gratitude and disbelief appeared from people all over the world. I thought I was the only one feeling this way. I'm 62 and always tired. Thank you for sharing this. My doctor never told me this before. You may have saved my life. Margaret sat in her kitchen the next morning, stunned as the notifications kept pinging. Her little message, filmed between her cutting board and coffee mug, had reached far beyond her quiet town. Days later, she received an email from a health podcast host asking if she'd share her story. Then a nutritionist from Canada wrote to say he had started researching age-specific food reactions because of her video. Margaret realized this wasn't just her story anymore. It was something bigger, something that resonated with thousands of people, silently struggling the same way she had. Still, she stayed humble. Every evening she returned to her garden. There, among her herbs and vegetables, she found her peace. The kale she once prized so highly now grew quietly in a corner, untouched, while rows of watercress and romaine thrived under her care. Each plant represented a lesson learned, the balance between knowledge and intuition, between doing what's right and doing what's right for you. One afternoon, as she was trimming her herbs, her neighbor's teenage granddaughter, Lily, came by holding a small notepad. "Mrs. Collins," she said shyly, "I saw your video with my grandma. She said you helped her joint pain. Can you show me how to make one of your meals?" Margaret smiled, her heart softening. "Of course, dear. Let's start with something easy." They spent the next hour in the kitchen, chopping vegetables and laughing. Margaret taught her how to prepare a warm salad with roasted zucchini and pumpkin, drizzled with lemon and olive oil. Lily scribbled every detail into her notebook, her curiosity shining. "You know," Margaret said as they sat down to eat, "health isn't about age. It's about awareness. You're young now, but one day you'll realize that what you eat, how you move, and what you think, it all talks to your body. You just have to listen closely." Lily nodded thoughtfully. "I think I get it. You're like the veggie whisperer." Margaret laughed so hard her eyes watered. It was the most joyful sound that had filled her kitchen in years. That evening, as the sky blushed pink and the crickets began to sing, Margaret sat outside on her porch swing, watching the sun dip below the trees. She thought about everything that had unfolded since that one unsettling doctor's visit, the fear, the discovery, the change, and now this strange, beautiful ripple effect touching lives she'd never met. She realized something important then. Her healing wasn't just physical. It was spiritual. Her body had been trying to speak to her, yes, but so had life itself. The lesson wasn't just about vegetables. It was about listening to signs, trusting her instincts, and embracing change instead of fearing it. She took a slow breath, feeling gratitude spread through her chest. "Thank you," she whispered, to her body, to her doctor, to the universe that had nudged her toward awareness. The next day, she received a letter in the mail. It was handwritten from a woman in her 70s who had watched the video. "Dear Margaret," it began. "Your story gave me courage. I thought my pain was punishment for getting old, but now I understand. It was just a message. I've made the changes you suggested. My husband says I smile again. Bless you." Tears welled up in Margaret's eyes as she read it. That single letter was worth more than anything else, more than views, more than recognition. It was proof that her small act of honesty had sparked real healing. Weeks later, she was invited to speak at a community wellness fair. Standing before the crowd, She looked out at the faces, young and old, curious and hopeful, and smiled. She wasn't nervous this time. She spoke about the myths of health, the importance of listening to your body, and the miracle of transformation that begins when you decide you deserve to feel good again. At the end, someone asked, "If you could give one piece of advice to everyone here, what would it be?" Margaret paused, then said softly, "Never assume pain is just part of aging. Sometimes it's your body whispering that it's time to change." The audience clapped, not just for her words, but for the strength behind them, the strength of a woman who had turned confusion into clarity and fear into purpose. That night, back home, she made herself a cup of tea and gazed at the stars from her kitchen window. She smiled at her reflection, no longer tired, no longer uncertain. She had learned that health wasn't about chasing youth or perfection. It was about partnership with her body, her mind, and the wisdom that came with time. Outside, the garden swayed softly in the night breeze, the scent of herbs drifting through the air. Margaret closed her eyes and whispered one last thought before heading to bed. "Sometimes," she said to herself, "healing begins the moment you stop eating what hurts and start feeding what heals."